Hey there, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. I was supposed to be scanning requisition forms and filing document tags for old territorial maps, not opening metal containers with no labels and no history. That morning, I had 2 coffee-stained printouts in the queue and half a peanut butter sandwich I'd left in the break room fridge 3 days ago. Nothing about my shift screamed, "This is the day you find proof the government buried a biological event in the late 19th century. But that's what happened. The box showed up with a courier manifest from a military records facility that closed down 3 years ago. No barcode, no routing tag, no digital log, just a paper slip attached with a rusted staple and the words "unfiled, do not process." Normally that's a red flag. Anything tagged like that means it's either misrouted or sensitive. I should have pushed it up the chain. I didn't. I was bored, underpaid, and curious. It was heavy, built from thick steel with reinforced corners. Not standard archive gear, something meant to last. I unlatched the lid and peeled it open slow. Inside were leather-bound journals, some with army insignias, others with hand-scratched seals I didn't recognize. One bore the stamp for the Department of Indian Affairs from the 1870s. The papers smelled like rot and dust, not a museum kind of smell. Something older, sealed in long enough that it didn't know what decade it was anymore. I started flipping through them without gloves. Stupid maybe, but I wasn't thinking about contamination. I was thinking about the handwriting. The ink was still sharp in some places, faded in others. Real quill strokes. Actual boots-on-the-ground records. Some talked about cattle deaths. Others mentioned entire outposts going silent. A few referenced symptoms. People wandering. Strange behavior. Fever followed by violent attacks. One even used the phrase, "sleepwalkers with hunger." I'd seen that term before. In a half-buried case file I once helped digitize for a Nevada mining dispute from 1871. What really stopped me were the photos. Old tin types, cracked glass plates. Most were damaged, but not enough to miss the details. One showed a town square covered in dirt, no bodies, but blood soaked into the soil around the trough. Another had 2 figures standing just off frame. The image was blurry, too long of an exposure, but their posture was wrong. One was leaning with his shoulder dislocated but still standing. The other's face was a pale smear with no clear eye placement, no detail around the mouth, just a loose jaw and smeared ink. I kept staring at it because it looked staged, but it wasn't staged. The photograph was taken by someone in the moment, not built for drama. The fear was in the way the frame avoided getting close. I found the first full report after that. It was filed under a name, Corporal Harold Grayson, stationed at Fort Pfeiffer, Arizona Territory. Date, July 23rd, 1872. It came with a folded, hand-inked witness statement and a final incident log. No edits, no crossouts, just the words as he wrote them, the last entry in the bundle. It started with a single line at the top, written with pressure so strong it bled through to the back of the paper. It said, "This isn't a fever, this is something else, and it's already inside the walls." I sat down on the floor of the records room and started reading. Grayson opened by describing a scouting dispatch. He and another soldier, Private Ellis, were sent to investigate a missing persons case near Blind Creek Junction. 2 civilian miners hadn't reported in. The camp was a half-day ride from the fort, dry terrain, no natural cover. When they arrived, the claim site was intact, mules still hitched, pickaxes leaned against a half-collapsed tent, the usual gear scattered. But there was no fire pit, no movement, no recent watermarks. The tent was torn open from the inside, no footprints out. They found the first body about 20 yards uphill, torsion damage, ribcage ripped, face stripped to bone. Grayson noted that it didn't look like animal predation, more deliberate, more segmented, not shredded, pulled. The second body was different, still breathing, pinned under a broken timber, skin baked from the sun, mouth crusted over, not talking. When Private Ellis approached and tried to speak, the man lunged. Grayson said it took 3 rounds from a Spencer rifle to stop him. The first 2 went into his chest. The third, aimed at the head, dropped him. They dragged the body down to camp and wrapped it in canvas. When they returned to the fort, the post surgeon dismissed it as dehydration, fever, heat stroke. The commanding officer, Colonel Redding, filed it as a self-inflicted breakdown. Case closed. The body was burned. No examination. Then things started happening faster. Livestock from the holding pens vanished. Night sentries reported movement near the creek bed. A telegraph rider from Red Knoll Outpost sent a partial message before going dark. When Grayson rode out with Captain Foster to check it, they found the station burned, bodies half buried under ash, and a warning carved into the walls, "Do not bury them." When they got back, Private Holston had collapsed in the mess tent, unresponsive, pale. He stopped breathing before sundown. They wrapped his body, covered it, and set the fire pile. By dawn, the body was gone. The blankets were torn. The rope had been chewed through, not cut. And 2 other soldiers were found dead near the edge of the stables, faces torn, arms broken at strange angles. It escalated from there. Fast. Grayson listed casualty after casualty, not in medical terms, just names and how they went down. Climbing the walls, digging under supply tents, hiding in the barrels during day, striking at night. He said their skin turned grey, lips blackened. Their walk became stiff, then jerky, but they never fully stopped. Bullets to the torso did nothing. Only direct trauma to the brain worked, and even that wasn't a guarantee. He wrote that he saw Colonel Redding dragged away near the munitions depot, said Captain Foster was still alive when the infected ripped his arms off. Grayson never used the word zombie. That wasn't language he had. He called them the Dead Walkers, or just them. No ceremony, no theory, just action, death, and the knowledge that whatever it wasn't stopping. His last paragraph read, "If you find this, do not enter the fort. Do not take prisoners. Do not treat them. Do not bury them. Burn the ground. This is not sickness. This is something else, and it remembers the shape of men." That was the last line. The next page had a list of names, presumed dead. 1 page later was blank. I flipped through the rest of the journal and found a folded letter addressed to Washington. It was never sent. I sat in the archive for another hour, just staring at the chest. I wasn't sure if what I found was real. Could have been a lost script, some overcommitted LARP project, or a government psyop dropped down the wrong chute. But the paper was dated with period ink, the type of ink that oxidizes with a specific fade, the kind of detail you can't fake without serious resources. The photos had stamps from studios that closed before 1900. The witness statement matched handwriting samples from a separate Fort Pfeiffer record. It's real, or real enough that someone went through a lot of trouble to bury it, and not in some conspiracy board way, in a quiet paperwork disappearance, the kind that erases a town's death with a line item and reroutes an entire outpost to abandoned. Fort Pfeiffer doesn't appear on any current military record. The coordinates are listed as part of a private ranch trust now. Satellite maps show rubble near the basin. I pulled that footage 3 days ago. I think this is the first incident. Not the beginning of infection in history, but the first organized containment we have proof of. If I'm right, it means the military has known for 150 years that this kind of outbreak could happen. They knew it didn't start with patient 0 in some lab. It didn't start with a bat, a monkey, or a vaccine. It started west of the Colorado River, in the sun-burnt soil of an abandoned fort nobody remembers anymore. After Fort Pfeiffer, I looked for overlapping records. I searched shipment logs, troop movements, and any dead telegraph lines recorded in the 2 years that followed Grayson's last letter. There weren't many. The routes were redirected. Some towns vanished from census maps. What caught my attention was a rail inspection note sent from a Union Pacific subcontractor in the spring of 1874. It mentioned a scout from Yavapai country bringing contaminated items, and that army hands declined transfer of the remains. The contractor didn't elaborate. No names, no description, just a location and a second phrase, underlined twice in pencil. Scout didn't burn. That got me into the Yavapai agency records. Most were handwritten ledgers or second-hand dictations. Poor preservation. Some were copies made decades later for a BIA report. But I found a translated transcript from a field interpreter, someone named Joel Sampson. His entry was dated June 11th, 1874. The notes were part of a field intelligence briefing intended for a U.S. Army survey team headed toward the Prescott region. The translation described a man who came down from the highlands, a Yavapai scout named Raska. He carried a satchel, part of a charred uniform, and a rifle wrapped in wet leather. His arrival was unannounced, and he was already wounded when he reached the supply trail. The interpreter's account didn't use dramatic language. It was mechanical, meant for government eyes. Raska had burns across his right side, fractured ribs, and blood around the mouth. He wasn't coughing. He wasn't feverish. But he refused food, didn't drink water, and wouldn't rest. All he said was that he had come to warn them. The interpreter asked what about, and Raska pointed west. He told them the sickness had crossed the Red Hills, that it had come back from the burned fort, that it had eaten itself underground and returned stronger. According to Sampson, Raska said, "The ones we buried began to breathe again." And then he said something I didn't understand until I read it 3 times. Their silence walks first, their noise comes second. I tried to understand what that meant. Maybe it was a cultural expression or a symbolic phrasing lost in translation. But if taken literally, it fits what Grayson described. The way infected approached silently, hid in barrels, climbed into shade, then made noise only when attacking. It's not a poetic phrase. It's a warning based on behavior, something observed. Raska asked for the satchel to be burned. Inside were fragments of bone, 2 arrowheads, and part of a military insignia. He claimed they belonged to one of the men who woke up wrong after dying. He said the bones kept cracking even after the fire. That's the line he used. Cracking after fire. Like joints popping, or bone bending under strain. Sampson's report notes that when soldiers refused to burn the bones immediately, Raska walked into the woods and set the fire himself. When they found him the next morning, the satchel was gone, and so was he. The ground was scorched. The bones were not there. The army followed up once. A junior surveyor filed a complaint that the Yavapai agency spoke in riddles and that the scout may have been unstable. He called the whole episode ritualized madness. But the documents were refiled that same week, moved into a section reserved for tribal unrest. Any mention of infection or abnormal behavior was removed. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't being erased by accident. Every mention of the outbreak, the infected, or anything matching those symptoms was either mislabeled, sealed under unrelated keywords, or reinterpreted as desert fever or tribal myth. The more clinical the language, the easier it was to hide it. But the patterns didn't change. Small teams went missing. Outposts burned. Letters stopped arriving. And always there was one survivor who didn't make it out clean. The scout, the rider, the messenger. I started tracking those. Any government memo that included phrases like solitary return, unknown exposure, or decline debriefing. In every case, the messenger died within a week or disappeared entirely. Some accounts noted delirium or wandering behavior. One man walked into a canyon and was never seen again. Another stripped off his uniform and refused to sleep indoors. One killed a dog without cause and claimed the animal smelled the bones. These were all buried inside notes about post-traumatic behavior. None were followed up. No one considered they might have been exposed to something biological. The next case that stood out happened in August of the same year, 1874. A rail inspector named Alphonse Tiddle filed a strange log while surveying new track segments near Caliente, Nevada. His notes were short but consistent. He reported a strong odor of rotting cloth coming from a sealed freight car that had not been opened in over 2 months. When asked why it hadn't been emptied, he said the delivery had been cancelled. The car was supposed to carry quarry tools, but the cargo never arrived. Instead, the car had been tagged and left on a siding spur near an abandoned depot. Tidal finally opened it on August 14th with a yard crew and a lantern. Inside were half-burned crates, signs of a small fire, and soot-covered walls. There was no cargo, just a layer of ash and what he described as the impression of a person curled against the rear wall. Not bones, not remains, just the imprint, like something sat there for days and left behind weight without a body. He said the soot was heavier near the floor, and that part of the wall had been gouged as if clawed from the inside. There were no lock marks on the outside. That report was sent by courier and signed by a foreman named Elijah Brock. 3 days later, Tydell was found dead in a switching yard, blood around his collar and bruising along the base of the spine. The doctor's report blamed heatstroke and a fall. Brock left the railroad a week later. No statement, no resignation letter, no further record. I knew then this wasn't isolated to Fort Pfeiffer. That wasn't a one-off flare-up. It wasn't a single cursed town. This was a pattern, moving east and north through rail lines, troop convoys, and supply chains. Everything matched. The silent approach, the erratic survivors, the reluctance to document what didn't fit existing categories of sickness. One of the last entries I read that night came from a telegraph repair log in Arizona Territory dated February 18th, 75. The technician noted repeated outages in the Sedona region and recorded a message that had been partially received before cutting off midline. The words were etched in pencil, copied by hand from a torn slip of tape. I no head wound, no death. Repeat, no head wound, no death. Signal tower compromised. It wasn't part of a standard transmission. The signal was not addressed to any known code or military station. The operator tagged it as rogue test noise and filed it under equipment malfunction. But that phrasing, no head wound, no death, that's what Grayson wrote at Fort Pfeiffer. That's what others hinted at, again and again. Bullets that did nothing unless they hit the brain. That one rule, that one anchor across all these years. I sat alone in the archive after midnight, lights off, monitor glow reflecting off the filing cabinets. I thought about the language, how none of the reports used the word walking dead. That word didn't exist in Western vocabulary at the time. Most called them sleepwalkers, or rot breathers, or flesh poor. The terminology didn't matter. The symptoms were consistent. The behavior matched. And what shook me most was how early they learned to hide it. Not the infected, the people, the officials, the surveyors, the ones who decided that it was better to call it sunstroke or madness, or fever, rather than say what it really was. I was still thinking about that when I heard my name called over the intercom, monotone, automated, but it cut through the silence of the stacks like a knife. Level 3 access review, report to security check, room B7. That wasn't standard. We didn't have levels here. This was a mid-tier government document storage site with a glorified librarian badge system. Even calling it a facility was a stretch. And nobody used room B7 unless something was broken or misfiled. My mouth went dry, and for a second, I just stood there holding the folder like I had forgotten what paper was. I shoved it in my bag, left the archive drawer cracked just enough to look accidental, and walked fast. Not too fast, not enough to draw attention. The hallway lights buzzed louder than usual. My palms started sweating halfway there. When I walked in, it was just the assistant supervisor, the one with the lazy eye and the habit of sniffing after every sentence. He looked up from a clipboard and made a face like I was interrupting something. Said it was a routine inventory audit. Wanted to double-check if I had logged a misfiled box under my name the week before. I nodded. Didn't speak. Just kept it short. I said maybe I opened a box from the wrong route batch. He didn't press. Just ticked a few things. Asked if I needed help rerouting it, then let me go. I kept my face neutral, told him I'd sort it after lunch, and left. I walked to the vending area and pretended to read the notice board. Grabbed a dry sandwich from the cooler. Ate in silence, chewing slower than usual, trying to calm the shake in my leg. Nobody had seen me digging through the old military lockbox. I had been alone that night. The cameras were still down in that aisle. I checked the maintenance log a week earlier, so either someone had come in afterward and found what I didn't refile, or someone had already known what was in that chest and was watching to see who opened it. I didn't go back to the box that day. I returned to the normal routine, scanned 2 mining ledger reels, flagged a misprinted postal schedule, and helped a new guy set up the microfilm projector for a Civil War discharge log. I smiled when I needed to, kept my head down, and didn't say anything out of pattern. But my thoughts didn't leave that room. When my shift ended, I walked straight home without checking my messages. I didn't stop for groceries or gas. I didn't even notice I'd left my work badge clipped to my collar until I got back to my apartment and tossed it onto the counter with my keys. I dropped onto the couch and didn't move for hours. At some point, I dozed off with the TV playing some old western I didn't recognize. The sounds of horses and gunfire didn't bother me. I was too far gone. The next morning, I had the day off. I thought about going back to the archive on my own time, pretending I'd left something in my locker, but that felt too risky. Instead, I went to the library. Figured I'd flip through some local history books, maybe find something interesting in the back matter, forgotten notes, misplaced annotations, anything. But it was all surface-level tourist fluff. Pioneer settlements, gold rush timelines, the same 3 stories about early rail builders. Not one mention of Fort Pfeiffer or the burned Red Knoll outpost. Nothing about Yavapai scouts or the silent freight car at Caliente. Just gaps, repeated and polite. I read for hours anyway, but I didn't retain anything. My focus was gone. All I could think about was the warning in Grayson's final report and the message carved into the wall of that burned-out outpost: "Do not bury them." The more I thought about it, the more I wondered how many people had read those words, reported them, and then were told to forget. Or worse, punished for remembering. When I returned to work the next day, everything was off. The lighting was dimmer than usual. The air was too cold. Some of the desks in the common area had been moved. My seat was still there, but the layout felt unnatural, like someone had tried to rearrange the room without understanding how people actually used it. That detail alone might have meant nothing. But then, I passed the central aisle near Archive 3 and stopped. The entire row of stack carts was gone, the carts where I'd first sorted the military chest. That kind of reorganization doesn't happen overnight. It takes planning, moving permissions, and usually an internal memo. I checked the bulletin board in the lounge. Nothing. No notices. No move orders. No explanation. Then my supervisor buzzed me, said he wanted a quick word. I walked into his office with my stomach twisting. He didn't close the door, but his tone was quiet. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't say I was in trouble. Just told me to remember that some documents come with historical sensitivities, and that our job isn't interpretation, it's preservation. Then he smiled, wished me a productive shift, and turned back to his screen. I left that office lightheaded. The thing that really got to me was how soft he played it. He didn't threaten me. He didn't ask for the box ID. He didn't reference a date, a file, or a title. He didn't need to. He knew. Someone knew. And I hadn't even been careful. I hadn't worn gloves. I hadn't tracked which folders I touched. I left fingerprints on at least 2 field reports and a dozen photographs. I'd taken notes in my own journal, and I left the box half open when the intercom call came through. I didn't even move the whole collection to another section. How stupid could I be? I told myself I'd let it go. Just walk away, refocus on the real job, get back to the safe routine of archiving and filing and ignoring the things that weren't meant for me. But I couldn't. I kept thinking about the scout, about Raska walking into the woods to burn something he knew nobody else would touch. I kept thinking about the train car and the crushed bones that cracked after fire. And most of all, I kept seeing that faded phrase from the Sedona relay: no head wound, no death. Still, I waited. I didn't go near the box again for a full week. I filed reports. I refilled toner. I helped a contractor with an HVAC filter request, and even sat through a fire drill without checking my phone once. But on the 8th day, just after the building cleared out for the evening, I walked back into the restricted aisle and checked the last place I saw it. It was gone. Not just moved, removed. The shelf slot where it sat had been scrubbed clean. The paper folder that used to mark the category was replaced with a different label, Closed Claim Review. That meant someone refiled the entire box as a settlement record. That wasn't just sleight of hand. That was administrative erasure. No tracking code, no digital receipt. Which meant one thing: whoever moved it knew how to do it without leaving a trail. I almost walked out right then. I almost left the building and never returned. But I didn't. Because when I stepped into the next row, Archive 5, Northern Correspondence Records, I saw something familiar, a faded red tag, military ink, not the box. Just one file folder, misaligned, leaning awkward in the shelf gap between two unrelated postal logs. I pulled it out. Inside was a single report, different handwriting, older paper, and stamped with a name I hadn't seen before. Cavalry Logistics Station, Elkhorn Canyon, March 18th, 76. It began with a journal entry from a wounded cavalry supply officer reporting that he'd found survivors, but they wouldn't talk. Said they just stood in the road watching him approach, eyes open, mouths closed, and when he asked what happened to the others, one of them finally answered in perfect English. No one left to eat. The officer's name was Darius B. Carter, attached to a mobile resupply detachment en route to Fort Marrow, west of the Divide. The year was 1876. His entries were part of a hand-bound journal recovered from Elkhorn Canyon, a failed supply post that never appeared on regional maps. According to his notes, the canyon had been chosen for its high walls, narrow mouth, and limited access. Easy to guard, easy to defend. It had been stocked with 2 months of grain, casks of water, spare ammunition, and equipment for repairs. Only a handful of cavalrymen were stationed there at any given time, rotating out every 10 days. Carter arrived on the 15th day of March and noted immediately that the air smelled burnt and sour. There were no guards posted. The gates were closed but unbarred. When he entered, the first thing he noticed was the quiet. Not desert quiet, dead quiet. No animal sounds, no boots, no hammers, just wind moving across charred canvas. Half of the northern wall had been blackened by fire, but the stone beneath it was cold. He found signs of a campfire that had been extinguished with oil, not water. Whoever had put it out wanted it ruined, not saved. He circled the interior perimeter and saw 4 men standing just outside the armory shed. They were dressed in partial uniform, wrong belts, mismatched buttons, boots unlaced or missing entirely. One had no hat. Another had what looked like a strip of curtain tied around his neck. When Carter approached, they didn't react. No greeting, no movement. He asked where the others were. No answer. Then one of them turned to face him and spoke that single line. Carter's account gets less formal after that. His handwriting changes, more erratic, fewer full sentences. He said the man's voice was hoarse, but not sick, clear, intentional. But the phrasing wasn't right. Not the words, but the tone. He said it sounded too exact, like it had been practiced, not spoken naturally, like the man was repeating something he'd heard but didn't understand. After that, the group began to follow him. Not chase, not confront, just follow, step by step, always 5 or 10 yards behind. He backed out of the armory yard, circled toward the supply barn, and tried to signal them to stop. They didn't. He fired a warning shot. They flinched but didn't fall. One of them kept moving, even with a clean shoulder hit. When Carter climbed the barricade and retreated to the pass road, they didn't pursue. They just stood there again, watching. He made it to a field relay cabin 3 miles away and sent word through a civilian telegraph operator. The message was fragmented but included the key details. Canyon compromised. Unresponsive men inside. Do not send patrol. Avoid road after nightfall. That was the last entry in Carter's journal. He was later listed as unfit for reassignment and moved to a medical convalescent station in Northern California. No one followed up. No one returned to Elkhorn Canyon. I found this report by accident. It wasn't even supposed to be in our system. The journal had been part of a document loaned to a university archive 2 years earlier and never fully recalled. It had been scanned, indexed, and buried under a misfiled reference tag related to Spanish-American war logistics. I only located it because one of the key phrases, "Do not send patrol," matched a Telegraph entry I'd seen during a broken reel test the week before. After reading it, I knew I needed the rest of the collection, but that archive wasn't here. The physical copy had been forwarded to a secured off-site storage room downstate, an older facility with stricter access. I didn't have clearance, but I had the name of a friend who worked there during college. She owed me a favor. I called her that night, made up a story about a family military history project, and asked if she could pull the entry folder and get me access. She said no at first, said things were tighter now, audits more frequent, and that even interns were being checked. I told her I just needed 15 minutes. She agreed. One-time shot, no camera use, no copy permission. I'd have to take notes by hand, and I couldn't bring anything in or out. I said fine. I lied. The next day, I drove down early and signed in as a visitor. She met me at the side entrance and led me to a long, cold aisle lined with outdated filing cabinets. The lights flickered every few seconds, and the walls smelled like mildew and paper dust. She handed me the folder and stood outside to keep watch. Inside were more than just Carter's notes. There were troop dispatch lists, dated surveys, a hand-drawn canyon layout, and a separate envelope containing physical samples, cloth fragments, bone splinters, and a brass button partially melted at the edge. One slip of paper had a scrawled phrase, "No longer breathing, but not dead. Muscles still responsive. Delay and rot." That was the moment I stopped doubting. Whoever filed this wasn't confused. He wasn't speculating. He was documenting something he had measured. Decay rates, muscle tension, physical condition. This was autopsy-level detail. I flipped through as quickly as I could, photographing everything with a hidden lens I had built into a modified penlight. I told myself I was only preserving what they were trying to erase. But the moment I slid that penlight back into my coat, I knew I had crossed a line. I walked out, thanked her, and kept my face blank. She never asked if I'd copied anything. I think she knew. I also think she didn't want to be involved. That night, I stayed up reading the files, cross-referencing maps, and building a new timeline. Elkhorn Canyon wasn't an isolated case. It was a backup site. And when it failed, they didn't try to contain it. They abandoned it. The pattern was clear. Every incident site with evidence of infection was erased administratively. Not with science, not with quarantine, but with paperwork. Disappear the names. Fold the records into irrelevant categories. Move the boxes. Reassign the reports. By the time someone like me comes across it, the trail's too broken to follow. Except I was following it, and I wasn't done. I printed the map of Elkhorn Canyon. I compared it to modern topography. It's no longer a canyon. The area has been backfilled and renamed as a regional grazing basin. I found satellite photos showing unnatural leveling, cuts in the terrain that don't match erosion patterns. There are fence lines with no livestock and roads that lead to nothing. That's not chance. That's construction over evidence. Someone buried the place, literally. The last report in the folder was a typed memo from a logistics overseer named Thomas Selk, dated June 18th, 76. He wrote that all remaining materials from Elkhorn were reclassified as salvage, and that further review would compromise morale. He wrote, and I quote, "This infection, or whatever it is, cannot be cured, but it can be forgotten." That line had already rattled me, but what pulled the floor out from under me wasn't what Selk wrote. It was what someone else added in red ink on the margin. At first glance, it looked like a timestamp, but it wasn't. It was a notation code, and under it, in block caps, someone had initialed it with a modern ID signature. Confirmed, Major D.S. Sterling, April 21st, 2007. That signature changed everything. It meant that someone in a modern capacity had reread the memo. Not scanned, not glanced. Someone with military clearance had verified the authenticity of this document in 2007, over a century after it was originally written. Not only that, but they confirmed it. Not challenged, not discredited, confirmed. I ran the name through public and restricted databases. Most hits were scrubbed, but one property record slipped through. A Daniel Sterling, retired US Army Logistics, currently living in Cedar Junction, 5 hours from where I sat. A small home, single occupant, no dependents, utilities active. Last DMV renewal was 2 years ago. No social media presence. Phone listed under a generic provider but still active. He was real, alive, and very close. I debated for hours. Part of me knew this crossed into dangerous territory. Visiting a retired officer to ask about sealed military history tied to a possible biological cover-up. That wasn't a research task anymore. That was a risk. But the moment I thought about stopping, the image of those silent men in Elkhorn came back. Their mouths shut, their boots wrong, the voice that spoke like it was repeating someone else's memory. I couldn't stop now. I've made up my mind, but I've decided not to rush and wait until my next day off. Few days later, I drove out early in the morning, took a back route to avoid highway cams. Not because I thought someone was watching, not yet, but because part of me already knew I was stepping off the map. I didn't call ahead, just showed up. The house sat on the edge of a residential pocket near a state forest line. Brown siding, old fencing, lawn half kept. The front door had a faded Marine Corps sticker, even though his record showed Army, a kind of mask maybe. I knocked twice and waited. There was no sound for a long time. I was about to turn around when the lock clicked, and a pale, tall man in his 60s opened the door halfway. He looked at me without saying anything. His posture didn't suggest fear, more like resignation, like he'd already guessed why I was there. I introduced myself, said I was a local researcher looking into declassified military records, and mentioned his name had appeared in one of the old review slips. I didn't give him the full story, just offered to buy him coffee or tea and hear about his time in logistics. I expected him to shut the door. Instead, he stepped aside and said the kettle was already hot. We sat at a small round table in a tight kitchen. No TV, no radio, no internet router I could see. The place felt 10 years behind on purpose. He poured tea from an old steel kettle, added nothing, and finally spoke. I wondered if anyone would come eventually, he said. Not angry, not surprised, just tired. I started slow. Asked how long he'd been in. He said 23 years. Retired after a transport-related internal investigation. I asked if he reviewed any historical records during his career. He smiled faintly and asked what I thought I was chasing. I told him honestly, I wasn't sure, that I'd stumbled onto a set of 19th-century Outbreak reports, that I thought they were part of a larger cover-up, that I wasn't trying to expose anyone, just understand what really happened. He didn't blink, just said, "You mean the ones with the silent men, the ones who walk too slow but never stop?" I didn't say anything for a long moment. I had my mug in hand, but I wasn't drinking. He saw my hesitation and gave a dry chuckle. "You people think it's all fake, movie nonsense, but it's close, you know. Those old reports, the ones you're reading, you'd be surprised how close they get to what's in our files. Even the comics, the eating part, the noise, the headshot stuff. You think they made that up?" That was when I lost my words. I just stared at him, because now it wasn't a maybe. It wasn't inference or suggestion or guesswork. He knew. I asked him how much he'd read, how far back it went. He didn't answer directly. He leaned back in the chair and rubbed his jaw. Let me put it this way. When I flagged that memo in 2007, I thought it was a fluke, a clerical relic. I wrote up a review summary, attached standard tags, sent it to a closed file queue. That night, someone from an internal security unit came to my office. Not even Army, not by uniform anyway. They pulled my phone, checked my drive access, and told me I was suspended pending an investigation. You know what they called it? He gave a long pause, then looked at me straight. Pre-treason behavior, that's what they said. I still have the letter. Never went to court. Just retired me early, full pension, and reminded me to stay quiet. Haven't touched a document since. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, I asked him if they were still monitoring him. He shrugged. Probably, but not the way you'd expect. You get quiet calls, unmarked mail. Sometimes a conversation that seems normal until you realize it's not. They don't need to threaten. They just remind you who still knows you exist. Then he leaned forward, voice lower now. What I don't get is you. You're not Army. You're not CIA. So why are you looking at this? You a journalist? A writer? What are you trying to prove? I looked at the table, the cup, the edge of a napkin folded too neatly. No, I'm not anything like that. I found it by accident. Wrong box on the wrong cart. But once I saw those photos, once I read what those men wrote, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd wake up hearing the silence they described. I'd replay the reports in my head like I was the one walking into those camps. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was obsession. It started to feel like the images wanted to be remembered. He nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked sad. Yeah, that's how it begins. He stood and rinsed his mug in the sink, kept his back to me. You need to leave this alone. Whatever you think you'll find next, it's worse than what you've read, and nobody's going to save you if you dig too deep. I didn't say goodbye. He didn't walk me out. I stepped outside into the daylight and sat in my car for a full minute before turning the key. There was no part of me that believed I was safe anymore, but there was also no part of me that could walk away now. The drive home felt longer than 5 hours. I kept checking my mirrors. Not because I saw anything, but because I expected to. Every unmarked van, every beat-up truck tailing me too long. I watched. I didn't take the same route back. I didn't stop for food. I didn't even pull into my apartment lot. I parked a block away and walked the last stretch, just in case. I spent that night making encrypted backups of everything I had. Scanned documents, audio notes, annotated maps, Sterling's name and address, copies of the Elkhorn memo, everything. I loaded it onto 3 separate encrypted drives and stashed them in different drop locations I'd used years ago for unrelated projects. I wasn't planning to disappear, but I didn't want this material to vanish with me if someone decided to erase more than just records. After that, I got back to work. Not at the archive. I took sick leave, said I was dealing with a family emergency. That bought me a week. I spent the first 2 days inside a local public records building, cross-referencing state death rolls, land transfers, and grave relocation permits. I was looking for one thing: bodies that had been moved. If everything I'd read so far was real, if Fort Pfeiffer, Elkhorn Canyon, and the sealed train car near Caliente had been erased with paperwork, then there had to be physical evidence too, and the only way to hide that was to rebury it. That led me to a string of reinterment orders issued quietly in the early 1880s. Most were dry and procedural: flooding, railroad construction, land disputes, but a few stood out. In each case, there was no corresponding weather event, no survey record, no legal challenge, just a formal note that said, "Graves relocated to preserve public health." That phrase repeated across at least 5 entries I found. The most obscure of them all was tied to a failed mining town called Oro Hollow, established in 1875 and dissolved by 80s. Official reason: contaminated ore, unsafe tunnel designs, and loss of life during an accidental collapse. But when I pulled the medical records filed to the state authority, something didn't match. The death counts were consistent for the time: illness, mine injuries, some fights. But the recorded burial numbers were double the deaths. One page listed 42 interments for a site that only had 18 confirmed fatalities. The other 24 were filed as discovered remains. No origin, no names, just a note: recovered West Ridge, partial condition, burial advised due to advanced decomposition. There was no map in the original file, but I found a hand-sketched diagram attached to a church ledger 2 years later. It showed a shallow grave plot on a ridge overlooking the mining camp, with a series of dashes drawn beside it. The dashes weren't labeled, but they ran down slope, away from the mine, away from the church, into the tree line. I checked satellite images. The ridge was still there. The town was long gone, just a few stone outlines, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The area had never been paved or redeveloped. It sat on Bureau of Land Management property. No roads went near it anymore. I made the trip the next morning. It took 4 hours. I parked near an old service road and walked the last half mile. Nobody was out there. No signs. Just rock, broken fences, and a slope that dropped into a crooked patch of pine and dirt. I climbed the ridge and looked for anything that might have marked the graves. Nothing remained. No stones, no posts, no crosses. But the ground was uneven in one specific stretch, and it didn't look like erosion. The soil was darker in spots, almost black. Not burned, not watered, just dead. Even the weeds avoided it. No ants, no spiders, nothing moving in the dirt, just stillness. I paced off the dimensions from the map and crouched near the third row of disturbed soil. The wind shifted. Something smelled wrong. Not rot, not fresh death. Older, earthy, metallic, like rusted iron buried too shallow. I didn't dig. I didn't need to. I already knew what was there. The only question was whether any of it had stayed down. I left that place and drove another 30 minutes into the nearest town, found the Historical Society, and asked if they had records on Oro Hollow. The woman at the desk said she didn't think so. Most of that history had been lost in a flood, she said. A lot of towns just disappeared, she said. Then she paused and asked why I was asking. I said I was researching unmarked cemeteries for a conservation project. She nodded, told me about an old priest who used to visit that ridge every year with a candle and a shovel. Said he stopped coming in the late 90s. Died of something sudden. I asked if he'd ever left a note, a record, anything. She said no, but she pointed to a filing cabinet near the back and said I was free to check the local newspaper archive. It only went back to 1921, but it was worth a look. I found one article from 1976, a letter to the editor unsigned. It warned that the ridge near Oro Hollow should not be cleared for grazing, and that a recent plan to level the area would disturb the unsettled. That was the word used. Unsettled. The editors published a reply the next week saying there were no plans to touch the land and that the town council had no comment. The matter was dropped. The man who wrote that knew, or knew enough to worry, but like everything else, his warning faded. By the time I got home that night, I was no longer cataloguing events. I was living them. I stopped checking for approval or advice. I stopped sleeping right. My dreams weren't nightmares. Just echoes, sounds that didn't belong to memory, images that didn't fade in the daylight. The door clicks, the ridge dirt that wouldn't hold shape, the man in Elkhorn who repeated a phrase he didn't understand. All of it looped, not with urgency, with inevitability. I'd sit down to eat and forget what I ordered. I'd walk into rooms and not remember why I went there. I started having conversations in my head that I couldn't finish out loud. The silence was filling in around me, same as the reports described. So I backed off. I told myself I needed a break, not an escape. I filed for 3 more days of leave, this time under my real name. No story, just health reasons. I shut off the encrypted drives, unplugged the backup server, locked everything physical in a document box, and left it under the floorboards beneath the water heater. Nothing high-tech. Just space, warmth, and distance from the files. I went to a matinee. I watched a movie I didn't care about. Loud, bright, weightless. The kind with no real consequences, no gravity in the plot. I laughed when the people on screen laughed. It didn't feel natural, but I made the sound anyway. Afterward, I walked to a cafe, sat in a sunny corner, and ordered something sweet for the first time in weeks. I called my girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, if I was being honest, and asked if she wanted to meet up later that week. She was surprised. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 months, but she said maybe. That was enough. That night, I drove out of town and showed up at my parents' house. My mother cried when she saw me, which caught me off guard. My father shook my hand like I was coming back from deployment. They asked if I was okay, and I said I just needed to be around real people for a little while. We watched old shows, ate microwaved meals, and talked about nothing. It helped. The edges of the obsession dulled. I started to feel like a person again, not a wire stretched too tight. But on the last night of my so-called recovery, I came home and found a letter jammed halfway under my apartment door. No stamp, no envelope, just a folded page, thick paper typed. What do you think happened to the scouts that survived the Nevada line fire? I froze in the hallway, holding the page like it might cut me. That phrase, Nevada line fire, wasn't public. It wasn't digitized. It appeared once in the corner of a burnt border dispute file I had flagged but never opened. I hadn't written about it. I hadn't spoken it aloud, not to anyone. Whoever wrote this knew what I had seen but hadn't even processed yet. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went back to work. I figured the only thing worse than going back was not going back. Walking away would only confirm what they probably suspected. It was a mistake. I got through the security checkpoint. Badge still active, no red flags on the scanner. I thought maybe I was in the clear, but the moment I stepped into the main archive floor, my boss was already waiting by my desk. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse, just motioned for me to follow him to the back. We stood near the staff lockers. He folded his arms and looked tired. You were warned. This isn't about research anymore. You crossed a line, and you know it. I opened my mouth to protest, but there was nothing to say. I had crossed the line. I'd stolen access, broken protocol, lied to everyone involved, and then vanished for over a week. He handed me a small envelope. Suspension paperwork. Indefinite leave pending review. He didn't look angry. He looked relieved. Like this wasn't punishment. It was removal. I packed up my things in silence. No one said goodbye. No one asked questions. Half the staff avoided eye contact. A few just stared like they already knew. I walked out of that building with a small cardboard box and a throat full of sand. When I got home, the door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I always did. My hand hesitated on the knob. When I pushed it open, I saw the lights were on. My living room window was open just enough to let the street sounds in. And on my chair sat a man in a brown leather jacket, casually flipping through my laptop. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't hiding. Just moving through tabs like he had every right to be there. Near the door, another man stood with a cup in one hand and something wrapped in foil in the other. He took a bite, chewed, and nodded at me like we'd met before. I didn't recognize either of them. I turned around to leave, but the one in the jacket spoke up. Come on, you already knew this was going to happen. They didn't show weapons. They didn't raise their voices. But when they moved with decision. The one at the door slid behind me. The other stood slowly, closed the laptop, and placed it on the coffee table. Let's go. I resisted. I told them they had no warrant, no ID, no cause. That didn't stop them. They didn't touch me hard. Just enough to steer. Enough to let me know I wasn't walking out of this on my own terms. We left through the stairwell. No neighbors looked. No one asked. Their car was plain, dark grey, no markings. I was placed in the back. Windows were tinted. The ride was silent. I don't know how long it lasted. Might have been 30 minutes. Might have been 3 hours. We went underground at some point. I lost signal on my phone before I could even consider texting anyone. The building wasn't labelled. It didn't look military or federal. Just concrete and fluorescent lights. Sterile in the way new buildings try to look old. They led me down a hallway and into a blank room with a table and 3 chairs. The walls were plain, painted in dull white that reflected light without warmth. There were no windows. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the temperature was cooler than it needed to be. Someone had calibrated this place to make visitors uncomfortable without being obvious about it. I sat there long enough for my legs to ache from the rigid metal chair. No clock, no sound, just the hum of recycled air. After some time, an hour, or maybe several, a woman walked in wearing a plain grey suit. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't show a badge. She placed a folder on the table and sat down like she had done this 1,000 times. She opened it, flipped a few pages, and asked if I knew why I was there. I told her I didn't. I already knew that denying everything wouldn't help. She tapped the folder lightly and said I had accessed restricted files without authorization, removed classified content from a federal facility, transported it across state lines, and attempted to make contact with a retired official who was under a sealed compartment gag order. She said all of it placed national security at risk. I asked her if she had evidence of any harm. She ignored the question. She asked instead why I was looking into 19th-century military records. She didn't say outbreak. She didn't say Pfeiffer. She didn't say infection. She didn't need to. Her tone implied that she knew exactly what I had read and how much of it I had copied. I stayed quiet. She stared at me for a long moment, then closed the folder and said that silence told her everything she needed to know. After that, she stood, opened the door, and walked out without looking back. 2 men replaced her, different suits, different shoes, same expression. They asked the same questions phrased in slightly different ways. Did anyone else know what I saw? Did I share files? Did I upload anything? Did I speak to the press or foreign contacts? Each time I answered, they wrote nothing down. It was clear the questions weren't for gathering information. They were measuring my reactions, the pace of my breathing, how I moved my hands, whether I hesitated before answering. Surveillance disguised as interrogation. At one point, they brought in my laptop, the one they had gone through at my apartment. The screen showed the archive directory I had built for the Outbreak files. They pointed to the folder names, asked who had helped me organize them, asked why I had chosen certain labels. None of the questions concerned historical content. They focused entirely on my actions, not the evidence itself. They treated the Outbreak reports as if the subject matter was irrelevant, like they were props in an unrelated crime. I tried to argue that what I found mattered, that there was a pattern of incidents stretching more than a century, that the public had a right to know. One of the men told me to stop talking, not loudly, just firm enough to cut the air. They left again. The lights dimmed automatically. The room grew colder. I don't know if hours passed, or if they were staggering the sessions to distort my sense of time. When the door opened again, a different man entered. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a dark jacket and plain boots. He sat down and placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. It was a non-disclosure form, not the standard type used in classified work. This one was harsher, written in narrow legal language that cut out all room for argument. It stated that I had willingly disseminated restricted information and that I understood the consequences of further disclosure. He pushed a pen toward me and said signing it would simplify things. I asked what would happen if I didn't sign. He said nothing. He didn't threaten me. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat there with a stillness that carried its own weight. After a moment, he took the paper back, folded it, and placed it in his jacket. Then he leaned forward and said there were 2 options. Both would ensure the information I collected would never reach the public. One was voluntary compliance. The other was medical reassignment, which he described as a protective measure for individuals experiencing stress-induced delusions after exposure to historical trauma. He said it as if it were routine, not destructive. That was the first time I realized they didn't need proof to move me out of the way. They just needed a category to place me in, and they already had one ready. He stood and left without waiting for an answer. I don't know how long I stayed in that room before they finally brought me to another space. A dorm-like wing with small doors, each with a slot for meal trays. They didn't lock me in, but they didn't let me leave either. There were other people there. Some stared blankly at the floor. Some paced in slow patterns, as if afraid to break an invisible boundary. Others avoided eye contact altogether. No one spoke. Not because they couldn't, but because something in the environment discouraged it. A nurse brought medication at regular intervals. She told me it was for anxiety. The pills dulled everything. They didn't knock me out. They just smoothed over edges I needed to keep sharp. On the second day inside that wing, I realized the staff wasn't reading any charts. They weren't evaluating anyone. They were watching for compliance. They made notes, but not medical ones. They observed who resisted the pills, who questioned authority, who asked for outside contact. I saw one man try to refuse, and within 10 minutes 2 orderlies escorted him down a different hallway. He didn't come back. That same evening, I wrote down my thoughts on a scrap of cafeteria paper I had saved from lunch. The words were plain, direct, nothing coded. I kept it folded under my mattress. I wrote that I needed a plan. I wrote that I needed to stay alert even with the medication. I wrote that someone had decided my curiosity constituted a threat. Seeing it written made it real, and that scared me more than anything in the files ever had. So here I am, but I don't know where here is. Several days have passed. I have spoken to various people, and they have not given me a lawyer, saying only that I want to harm the country and undermine confidence in the government. They just told me that I would be placed in a psychiatric institution where no one would care about my information, and under the influence of pills, I wouldn't care about anything either. They said the goal wasn't punishment but stabilization, that I was too involved in events I didn't understand, that I had crossed lines meant to protect the public from harmful narratives. None of them ever mentioned the outbreak directly. They talked around it, like the subject itself was a restricted object. The worst part was how calm they were. No anger, no alarms, no dramatics. Every person I spoke to treated my situation as if it had already been decided, as if I had been on a list the moment I opened that metal chest back in the archive. I asked one attendant, a young woman with tired eyes, whether she believed any of this was justified. She didn't answer right away. She just stood there holding a tray of pills and water. Then she said something that stuck with me. Some things shouldn't come back, not in files, not in stories, not anywhere. After that, she told me to swallow the pills. I tried to stay awake that night, but the medication made the world drift. Not like sleep, more like the space between thoughts stretched until they no longer connected. I could still move, still think, but everything was softened. I felt myself slipping into the kind of compliance they wanted, the kind where you don't ask questions because you forget what they were. The next morning, they moved me to a transport van. Not shackled, but seated between 2 guards. They told me I'd be taken to a long-term observation facility. Fresh environment, professional care. They said the place was quiet, with plenty of nature around it. That phrase alone made my stomach drop. I had seen the descriptions of remote facilities in the classified memos. Nothing about them was therapeutic. They were burial sites for the living. We drove for hours along rural roads. The landscape flattened, then rose, then narrowed into a corridor of pine. The van slowed near a gated entrance with a numeric keypad and a small guard station staffed by 2 men in plain uniforms. They checked paperwork, nodded, and raised the barrier. The building ahead looked like a lodge from a distance, but up close it was reinforced concrete covered with decorative siding. Windows were narrow and placed too high for any occupant to see through. This wasn't a hospital, it was containment. They escorted me inside. A woman in a white coat approached, clipboard in hand, smile too wide. She introduced herself, asked if I had any allergies, and guided me to a small room with a bed, a nightstand, and a barred ventilation grate. She explained the rules: meals brought to the door, daily check-ins, medication protocol, no personal electronics. It all blended into background noise. I knew I had been removed from my life. Everything familiar was gone in a single sequence of movements. But something happened before they closed the door. A man down the hall, older, grey hair, thin, stepped toward the entrance of his room. He watched me with an expression I couldn't place. Not fear, recognition. He raised his hand slightly, palm outward, not waving but signaling. When our eyes met, he mouthed a single word. Records. The guard noticed and shoved him back into his room. The door slammed, but the word stuck. He knew something. He had seen something. Maybe he had tried the same path I had taken. Maybe he had been dragged here for identical reasons. They thought these people were contained, but their minds were not erased. They remembered. The institution was full of witnesses disguised as patients. Later that night, after the final round of medication, a nurse came to check vitals. She adjusted the light, recorded a few numbers, and whispered quietly while pretending to examine my wrist. She said she had seen my name come through 2 days earlier and recognized it. She said she had an uncle who once worked at a federal geological survey site in Utah, and that he had been removed after discovering burial irregularities near a canyon formation. She said he vanished 3 months later. Her voice didn't shake. She spoke as if she had accepted this as part of the world. Then she said something that changed everything. "You're not here because you're wrong. You're here because you got too close." Before I could respond, she straightened her coat and left quickly, leaving me with nothing but the echo of her words. I knew then that I was not going to be rehabilitated or treated or convinced of anything. They weren't trying to fix me. They were isolating me, removing me from a chain of information that had survived too long and reached too far. The institution wasn't for the unstable, it was for the inconvenient. So I made a choice. Not dramatic, not heroic, just simple. I refused the next round of pills. When the nurse tried to insist, I held the cup but did not swallow. She noticed. She shook her head slowly and said refusing treatment would cause problems. I said everything about this already caused problems. She didn't argue. She took the cup, made a note, and walked out. 10 minutes later, 2 orderlies arrived. This time, they didn't speak. They escorted me down a long hallway to another wing, doors heavier, lights dimmer. The air felt colder. A different supervisor met us there. A man in a dark coat with a badge clipped to his belt. He looked directly at me and said refusal of medication meant mandatory sedation and relocation to a higher security unit. He asked if I understood. I nodded. I understood everything. He gestured toward an open room. Inside was a restraint chair. The straps were clean. The floor was clean. Everything was arranged with the same precision and lack of emotion I had seen back in the archive when boxes were quietly moved from one shelf to another. They sat me down. They locked the straps. One of them prepared an injection. The supervisor watched without blinking. I took a breath and said I wanted to make a final statement for the record. I don't know why I said it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe defiance. Maybe hope. The supervisor hesitated for half a second, then nodded. I said that everything I had seen, all the documents, all the burial transfers, all the classified memos, pointed to a truth that would surface again, no matter how deep they buried it. I said the infection they tried to erase had never gone away. It had only been managed, contained, moved, reframed through generations of altered paperwork. I said someone would find the trail again because the truth wasn't hidden in one file. It was scattered across everything they built to cover it. I reminded him that outbreaks didn't stop just because someone stopped writing them down. He didn't respond. He signaled the orderly instead. The needle touched my arm. Before everything went dark, I saw movement through the doorway. The older man from the hall, the one who mouthed, "Records." He wasn't speaking now. He was smiling, small and deliberate, like he knew something I didn't. And then it all went silent. When I woke up, I was no longer in the institution. I was in a private hospital room with soft lighting and a television mounted on the wall. My hands weren't restrained. My clothes had been changed. A nurse entered and told me I had suffered an acute stress collapse at work and was undergoing evaluation. She said my employer had placed me on indefinite medical leave. She asked if I needed anything. I asked where my belongings were. She said they had been returned to my apartment. I asked if anyone had visited. She checked a chart and said no. She didn't mention the institution. She didn't mention the men in suits. To her, None of it existed. When I was finally discharged, I returned home expecting to find everything gone. Instead, the apartment looked almost the same. Too much the same. My laptop sat on the table, freshly cleaned. The drives I had hidden under the water heater were untouched, but when I opened them, every Outbreak document had been wiped. Every scan, every note, every photo, gone without residue or trace. I sat in the quiet for a long time, trying to understand if this was defeat or survival. Someone had decided I wasn't worth eliminating, only erasing. But they didn't erase everything. They forgot one thing. They left me alive, and I remember every word. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you. What moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership. Carlos Herrera, Dominique Johnson, The Great Anywho, Jadala, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell, William Blackwell, TJR. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.